We'll get you there yet. Um, I want to say amen to what Gary said there a minute ago. We need to think more about those that are less fortunate than we are. And I'm proud to say that we are starting to a mission outreach here more than we have in the past. We've always tried to do it. Shirley did a good job, and Dave Stewart's taken over, and we're going to do some more. I think we did some this week with one in, where was he? Kenya. We're helping a preacher there. And, Jesus said in Matthew, blessed are those, welcome into the kingdom those that have, that you fed me when I was hungry, and you gave me drink when I was thirsty, and you clothed me when I was naked. And they said, when did we do that? We didn't know we were doing that. And he said, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. So we have to remember that, and I think we do, and we are working hard to do that. And to get into the sermon that I have this morning, you all know that Matt called me yesterday morning, and I worked all day trying to get this thing prepared. And so I want to start off. We're entering into a season that people call the Easter season, and it's here right now with us. There's Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans, and the Mobile and Rio de Janeiro and Asheville. I have a problem with Asheville. I lived in New Orleans for a while, and it's hard for me to comprehend Mardi Gras in Asheville. All those things were started as an effort to highlight the good news of Christ's resurrection. I think they've gotten a little off track. I don't advocate us starting to celebrate Mardi Gras, but it's really, it was started for a good purpose, but it degraded into something much worse. But 3 weeks from now, on April 1st, is going to be Easter. There's some irony there, I think, but we only have people come many times. We have people coming from coming to church on Easter and Christmas. I recognize that I'm thankful that they're coming. Don't get me wrong. I'm thankful that they come and worship with us those 2 days. But I recognize that going to church by itself is not make you a Christian. Does not make a Christian. But absenting yourself from the services says a great deal about what you think about being a Christian, how important you put on it. So there's 2 sides to that story. But I want to start this morning to kind of get us in the spirit of Easter. Now, Matt has a series of sermons going on that are not necessarily directed toward Easter, but I want us to think about some things this morning. And this is a message that I call the 4 jewels of Easter. And I want to give you some words, first of all, from the first proclamation of Christ, of the gospel of Christ in Acts 2, when Peter, on the day of Pentecost, gave a sermon. And sometimes we ought to read that sermon over, because it is a great sermon that we could all use almost every week of our lives. But listen to this. Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Then in verse 32 and 33, he said, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. And then verse 36, therefore, let all Israel know, be assured of this. I like the King James, be assured of this. Assuredly know this. God has made this Jesus whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Now, with that proclamation of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus in mind, I'd like to tell you a story which is probably apocryphal. You know what that means? Apocryphal? It means that we tell it as the truth, but it's probably a myth. Nevertheless, it makes a point. This story is told about a soldier in the army of Alexander the Great, who, as they marched through Persia and conquered all the lands that Alexander conquered, this soldier found a bag full of jewels, the crown jewels of Persia. It was a ornate leather bag, and he looked inside, saw these shiny rocks, decided they were worthless, poured them out, and took the bag. For some time after that, he could be seen carrying the bag and bragging to those around him about the beautiful leather bag that he carried his goods in, his earthly goods. But we kind of laugh at the story like that. We first of all, you know, a soldier back then probably wouldn't have dumped out shiny stones. Not many people would. But we got to think about how often in life we hang on to the things that are worthless and throw away the things that are valuable. How many times do you suppose we've clutched the bag of pleasure and pursued those things that bring us only momentary satisfaction? We eat too much, we drink too much, we drink the wrong things. Some people dull their mind with chemicals and throw away the precious jewels of physical health. Or how many times do people succumb to the lust of the eyes and flesh, searching for some kind of temporary sexual gratification? They cling to the little leather bag, and in the process they throw away the precious jewels of a good marriage. How many times do people pursue the material things of this world, thinking if we can only get that pot of gold, then we'll be satisfied? They work extra hours, they work weekends, they separate themselves from their families, and they clutch that bag of material gain, and they throw away their family. I think these things become a little more obvious at Easter time. That people are grabbing the bags and throwing away the jewels, of the precious jewel of the resurrection of Christ. They completely forget about it the rest of the year. So let me share with you this morning four precious jewels of Easter. And as I talk about them, you'll probably think, that's not precious. What's precious about that? But you'll see what I mean. Stones are often deceptive. I'll tell you a story. When you first see one, you may think it's valuable. People come into the museum all the time and ask us, what's this stone? Is it valuable? Many times, if not most of the time, we say, well, it's a leverite. They say, oh, wow, does that mean it's valuable? Then we tell them, no, that means leave it right where you found it. That's like a rock hounder's term. And on the other hand, I know of an instance here at First Christian where a lady found a large sapphire, about that long, about big around as my thumb. Would have been reasonably valuable as a specimen. And against my advice, she took it to a stone cutter to cut a stone to make it into a ring. Well, first of all, the sapphires that you normally find around here are not gem quality. But as a specimen coming from Macon County, North Carolina, they're valuable because not many of them are found today. But she wound up taking it to a cutter, and he, a few weeks later, gave her a ring with a cheap stone, wasn't a sapphire, for which she paid way too much, and he kept the stone, which was probably worth as much as she paid for the ring. 350, 250, something like that. So it's sometimes hard to tell what the value of a stone is unless you know a little bit about it. Sometimes you have to see the stone sparkle in the sunlight. You have to see you have to develop an eye for it. And I don't have an eye for precious stones. Some of the people that I deal with on a daily basis do, and they can recognize one in an instant. Sometimes even they get fooled as to what's valuable and what's not. I forgot to bring the water up here like I was going to do. That's all right, I'll make it. But the first precious stone of Easter is the realization of the tragedy of sin. And you're probably saying, well, I see what you mean. I don't see where that's valuable. But it's one of those things we just as soon throw away. In the process of throwing it away, we cling to that bag of self-righteousness. Jesus said, they worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. So I ask, have we come to grips with the tragedy of sin? Many times we try to cover it or justify it and convince ourselves that it's all right with God. Maybe everybody else's sin is wrong, but mine's not so bad. Okay? Recently someone said, we used to hiss at the villains, but today we buy their books. And that's another way of saying that we've convinced ourselves that sin is really not all that bad. We can live comfortably with it. We seem to think that since we've accepted it, God has accepted it too. Easter and the resurrection come, and we seem to reach the conclusion that just like the snow that we had the other day that looked so beautiful and covered up everything, Easter with the flowers that come up and blossom out will cover up all the wrong that's been done. Thank you, Ron. And the tragedy of sin is cast aside. I woke up with a problem this morning, and I've still got it, I guess. Steve Garvey was a professional baseball player, and he set many records. He was known as Mr. Clean. But shortly after he retired several years ago, and this was in the early 90s, newspapers featured an article about him that revealed he had gotten 2 women pregnant. Now, this happened while he was in the process of divorcing his first wife, and then he left one of the women that he impregnated and married another. But the newspaper reported that when these 2 women sued him for child support, Garvey commented that, well, I'll live up to my moral obligations. I'm a Christian. Excuse me. That bothers me. Someone needs to tell Mr. Garvey and a host of others about the tragedy of sin. Someone needs to tell these people that Christian men don't go around cheating on their wives or impregnating women and then casting them aside like a used toy. Does that happen? Have we seen it happen? If you can't think of any names, see me afterward and I'll give you a couple. These people give Christianity a bad name. They're an insult. They're an insult to every one of us that try to live a Christian life. And it pains me when I hear somebody say, well, I'm a Christian. And, excuse me, you go out and play golf every Sunday, but you're still a Christian? What do you think about Christianity? Do you ever think about Christ? I don't know. It bothers me. We need to realize that sin is a real tragedy, because as long as we don't, we'll never come to grips with it and see our need for repentance. The realization of the tragedy of sin is a precious jewel that we do not dare to throw away. If you look at the cross, if you listen to the cries from Calvary, you'll recognize the tragedy of sin. And did you notice, by the way, the words in verses 23, he was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. Sin is such a tragedy that the only one worthy of paying the price for that sin was God's Son. So he handed him over to be crucified, and that's how terrible sin is in God's sight. The second jewel that I want to mention is the necessity of sacrifice. Again, you probably don't think that one is a jewel, either because we do live in a self-indulgent society. We would just as soon cast that one aside and cling to our bag of self-indulgence. Is that right? Do people do that? You know, it's been one of my pet peeves for many years. This started back in the 90s. In fact, I expressed this to one of the congressional people that came to visit our county in Texas where I worked. It's been one of my pet peeves that we eliminated the draft, when we eliminated the draft and went to a professional army in the military, we lost the ability to teach young people that society requires sacrifice in order to survive. We need, in this country, a service. It costs money. The taxes would have to go up. But we need something that these people out of high school, every mother's child has to serve 2 years serving this country. That's my pet peeve. I'll get on off my soapbox. And I got to say that I'm going to give another illustration here, but I wanted to say ahead of time that I downloaded this sermon and I've adapted it to myself and made a lot of changes to it, but from a preacher of the Christian church in Brownsville, Texas. I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago I got this in preparation. If I was ever called on, I'd need something. And you'll see why I'm saying this. I didn't know that this next illustration was in there until I got to it yesterday as I was reading. But in the 1980s and 90s, Donald Trump, we've all heard that name, was the entrepreneur's entrepreneur. He was a yuppie's yuppie. He was often featured in newspapers and magazines, and Newsweek magazine said, for better or for worse, in the 1980s it became okay to become ferociously ambitious, staggeringly, it's easy for you to say, rich, utterly at ease in bragging about it. And Donald Trump said, life is a game and the ultimate scoreboard is money. Okay, we're off of that. I'll tell you, I'm gonna tell you this story. I have some misgivings about this one, but story about a young yuppie who wrecked his Ferrari. And he's standing outside. He didn't hurt himself, but he got out and he's saying, "Oh, my beautiful Ferrari is it's totaled." An officer walks up to him and says, "Sir, you must be in shock. Your left arm is really bad shape." And he looks down, the yuppie looks at he says, "Oh, my Rolex." Yeah, that's a sick story, but we live in sick times, and sacrifice is not usually in our vocabulary. We want a religion that doesn't require sacrifice, not even for a moment. Another fellow, Bob McFall, was a 39-year-old bachelor, suffered from aplastic anemia. He needed a bone marrow transplant, excuse me. A search was conducted among his family and all, and they discovered that a first cousin was the only one that was available or had the ability to donate bone marrow so that this fella could live on. But when the cousin was approached and explained to him that there would be no harm to him, it might be painful for a while, but there would be no harm, he refused to give any bone marrow. So McFall sued his cousin, took him to court. The trial drug on for several weeks. Finally, the verdict came down. The judge said that while the behavior of the cousin was reprehensible, the court ruled that it could not force him to give any bone marrow. The fellow Bob McFall died 3 weeks later. And so we see that sacrifice, even among family members, is not always thought to be necessary. But look at the contrast of that to the cross. God saw us wallowing in sin, and he realized that the only remedy was a blood transfusion, and that blood was the holy blood of his son. Jesus could have said, I'm not going there. I'm going to stay here. In fact, that's exactly what Satan was trying to get him to do when he tempted him in the desert. And he resisted and said, I'm going to do it anyway. And he knew his mission from the very start. He knew that he had come to this world to die on the cross. There's a necessity for sacrifice that comes as a result of the tragedy of sin. The third jewel that I want to mention is the genuineness of grief. In Luke 24, you see some of the friends of Jesus gathered around after they had taken his body down from the cross and laid on the tomb. And they said, we thought he was the one sent from God who would redeem the people of Israel. Listen to that. Did you hear the grief and disappointment there and sorrow? You see, all their plans for the future revolved around Jesus and his kingdom on earth. They were going to be on his right hand and his left hand. They would be the entourage that preceded the royal procession. It would be all peace and prosperity for everyone. And what great dreams they had. And now they were all dead. He was dead, and all their hopes were dead with him. You know, us older people, they say, think about the hereafter a lot. Now, I know none of you out there are old enough to know what I'm talking about, but very often, probably twice, 3 times a week, I go into a room and say, now what am I hereafter? So, yeah, we do think a lot about the hereafter, most of us, and what is it going to be like? You know, we've read the stories in the Bible, and really we'd like to know what goes on. It's a total. There's so many ideas about what happens after death. We often think about it. Jerry Kramer, who's now 82, he was a great football player at Green Bay when Vince Lombardi was the coach there. Once said in one of his books, I think a lot about death these days. So don't we all? Perhaps as we get older we do, because God has implanted us with a seed of immortality. We're all created in the image of an immortal God, and we all desire to live forever. And so that's what makes Easter special. Every one of us wants to live beyond the grave. And even those who don't believe in Jesus think they want to live beyond the grave. But we don't want death to interrupt our plans. We think, I'll go on vacation next summer and do this and that. I'll watch my grandkids grow up and graduate and get married and have become responsible adults, and on and on and on. And I'll be married 50 years or 60 or 60, 70. Is that what the next one is for Richard and Marie back there? We think we'll go on forever. We don't think about what's going to happen tomorrow. James says, don't count on tomorrow because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. He also says your life is but a vapor. It appears for a short while, then vanishes away. You ever seen steam on a tea kettle, how quickly it goes? We go that quickly too. It's like that compared to God. So listen to the sobs on Calvary. Listen to the cries. The grief that they showed there was real, and it's precious stone. It shows the tragedy of sin, the necessity of sacrifice, and the genuineness of grief. We travel through all of these valleys before we come to the certainty of joy. The certainty of joy is the message of the resurrection. If you travel with the women down that garden pathway and you come to that open tomb, they look inside at the grave clothes that were undisturbed and realize that Jesus has gone through them. He's not among the dead, he's alive. You hear their excited voices as they go from person to person. He's alive, he's alive. He's not in the tomb. You know, there was a first-time traveler that came to the Grand Canyon and looked over the rim. How many have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, several of you. It's an awesome sight. He looked over the edge of the tomb and says, wow, something big happened here. And it did, didn't it? Well, when we look into that open tomb, we can reach only one conclusion. Something big happened here. Something wonderful, something glorious, something beautiful, something eternal. Death and sin had been defeated. And our promise and our hope is all wrapped up in that empty tomb. Taste the joy, sing your hallelujahs, look into the tomb, and remember that something big happened here. And I'll tell you one more story about an old fisherman as the worship team wants to come forward. This is about an old fisherman who was a Christian. And he lived almost 7 miles from the church. 7 miles. He had to walk. He had a boat, but a boat didn't do him much good getting to the church. So every Sunday, he walked 7 miles to church and 7 miles back home. 14-mile round trip. But he loved God and he loved God's people, and he wanted to be with them. So he didn't even consider it to be a sacrifice. But one day, it was stormy and raining and really bad, and it took him a lot longer to make the 7 miles than he thought it would. And he finally arrived at the church just in time to hear the preacher say the last part of the benediction. Because of Jesus, now and forevermore, amen. Right at the tail end. He'd missed it all. As he stood there, the people went out and they were telling him how sorry they were that he'd missed the service and the fellowship and the sermon and the singing and all the things that he thought he enjoyed so much. And he replied to them, well, it's worth a 14-mile walk through the rain and the mud just to hear the words, because of Jesus, now and forevermore. That is our Easter egg, if you want to put it that way. Those are the words for Easter, now and forevermore. Because Jesus Christ has conquered the temporary and made the eternal through his resurrection. You can taste the certainty of joy. You can rejoice in the victory that is Christ, and hear the words, if we die with him, we will also rise with him. We will live with him for all eternity. So this morning, if you're aware of the tragedy of sin and want to enjoy the certainty of joy that can be yours, then we extend an invitation to you as we stand and sing. Would you stand?